The blacksmith's daughter. Her father sold her like a broken plow because she bore no sons, until a weathered rancher with 3 orphaned children saw worth where others saw waste. The morning sun had barely crested the horizon when Clara Hartwell's world came crashing down around her ears. She stood in the doorway of what had been her kitchen for 16 long years, watching her husband Thomas load her few belongings into a wagon with the same care he might show a sack of grain. Her wedding dress, carefully preserved in cedar and lavender, lay crumpled in the dirt where he'd thrown it. The delicate lace she'd tatted by candlelight now stained with mud and trampled by his boots. 16 years, Clara, Thomas said without looking at her, his voice carrying the bitter edge of a man who'd convinced himself he was the injured party. 16 years I waited for you to give me a son. 16 years of watching other men's children play in their yards while ours stayed empty. Clara's hands trembled as she clutched the doorframe, her knuckles white against the weathered wood. She wanted to remind him of the miscarriages, the 3 babies lost before they could draw breath. The nights she'd wept into her pillow while he turned his back to her sorrow. She wanted to tell him about the herbs she'd choked down, bitter and burning, the prayers she'd whispered until her knees bled from kneeling on the hard floor of their bedroom. She wanted to scream that she'd tried. God knows she'd tried, but the words stuck in her throat like thorns. "Thomas, please," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the sound of chickens clucking in the yard. "We could try again." The doctor in the next county said there might be new treatments. "No more," Thomas cut her off, finally turning to face her with eyes as cold as January frost. "I've already spoken to Reverend Matthews. The marriage can be dissolved on grounds of your condition. Margaret Sinclair has agreed to be my wife. She's proven she can bear children, already has 2 from her first marriage, and she's young enough to give me the sons you never could." The words hit Clara like physical blows. Margaret Sinclair, barely 25, widowed and desperate for security. Clara had seen the way the younger woman looked at Thomas after church services, had noticed how Margaret always managed to need help with something whenever Thomas was around. But she'd never imagined. "Where am I supposed to go?" Clara asked, hating how small her voice sounded. "My father's been dead these past 5 years. I have no family, no money of my own." "That's not my concern anymore," Thomas replied, lifting the last of her possessions into the wagon. "You can stay with the church ladies until you figure something out. Or maybe find some old widower who needs a housekeeper and doesn't care about your limitations." Clara felt something break inside her chest, a sound like glass shattering in an empty room. She looked around at the home she'd made, the garden she'd tended, the curtains she'd sewn by lamplight during the long winter evenings. Every inch of this place held memories of her trying to build a life, trying to be worthy of love, trying to make herself into the wife Thomas needed her to be. "I loved you," she said, the words falling into the morning air like stones into a still pond. "I loved you with everything I had." Thomas paused, his hand on the wagon's side panel. For a moment, something almost like regret flickered across his features. Then his jaw hardened. "Love doesn't put food on the table or carry on a family name," he said. "Margaret will be here before noon. I'd prefer you were gone by then." Clara nodded numbly, gathering her shawl around her shoulders. She climbed into the wagon beside her meager possessions, feeling like she was attending her own funeral. As Thomas drove her away from the only home she'd known as an adult, she caught sight of Margaret Sinclair approaching from the other direction, her children in tow, and a satisfied smile on her young face. The church ladies, as it turned out, were kind but practical. They housed Clara in a small room behind the sanctuary for exactly 1 week before gently but firmly explaining that they couldn't support her indefinitely. The town, they said with carefully neutral expressions, was already talking. A divorced woman was a scandal, regardless of the circumstances. It was Mrs. Patterson, the minister's wife, who first mentioned the possibility of the auction. She spoke in hushed tones, as if the very words might contaminate her clean kitchen. Your father owes considerable money to several merchants in town, she explained, not quite meeting Clara's eyes. The debt has passed to you as his only living heir. If you can't pay. She trailed off, wringing her hands in her apron. What are you saying? Clara asked, though she suspected she already knew. There's a way to settle debts when there's no other option, Mrs. Patterson said carefully. It's not uncommon on the frontier. A public sale to cover what's owed. People need housekeepers after all, and you're still young enough to work. The word sale hung in the air between them like a curse. Clara felt her stomach turn over. You mean sell me? Like property? Mrs. Patterson's cheeks reddened. It's a legal arrangement. More like an extended employment contract. And truly, Clara, what other options do you have? No respectable family will take you on as help, not with your reputation. And there are no other single women's positions available in town. Clara stared out the window at the main street of Willow Creek, watching people go about their daily business. These were her neighbors, people who'd known her since childhood, people who'd watched her marry Thomas with hope in her eyes and were now watching her fall with something dangerously close to satisfaction. When? She asked quietly. Saturday morning. Market day. There will be enough people in town to ensure proper bidding. The days leading up to Saturday passed like a fever dream. Clara found herself studying her reflection in the small mirror above the washstand, trying to see herself as potential buyers might. She was 32, which wasn't young anymore by frontier standards, but she wasn't yet old enough to be considered past usefulness. Her brown hair still held no gray. Her hands were strong from years of farm work, and she could read and write better than many people in town. She also found herself remembering her father, dead these 5 years, from a fever that had taken half the town with it. He'd been a good man, gentle and kind, who'd taught her to doctor animals and showed her how to read the weather in cloud formations. He would have been horrified to know his debts would lead to this moment. But as Mrs. Patterson kept reminding her with increasingly strained patience, the dead couldn't pay their obligations. Saturday morning dawned gray and bitter, with a wind that cut through clothing like a knife. Clara dressed in her best remaining dress, a blue cotton that had seen better years but was still respectable, and braided her hair back severely from her face. She wanted to look neat and capable, like someone worth the investment. The walk from the church to the main street felt like a journey to the gallows. Clara kept her eyes fixed on the ground, but she could feel the weight of stairs following her progress. Word had spread quickly through a town of 800 people. Everyone knew why she was there. The makeshift auction block was nothing more than an overturned crate positioned outside Henderson's general store, but it might as well have been a scaffold for the dread it inspired in Clara's heart. A small crowd had already gathered, mostly men, though she spotted a few women standing in the shadows of nearby buildings, watching with the horrified fascination of people observing a public execution. Mr. Henderson himself served as auctioneer, his normally jovial face carefully professional as he consulted a ledger of debts. He was a kind man under normal circumstances, but business was business. "Ladies and gentlemen," he called out in his carrying voice, "we're here to settle the outstanding debts of the late Samuel Hartwell, as represented by his daughter Clara. The total amount owed comes to $67.43, a significant sum requiring immediate resolution." Clara felt her cheeks burn with shame. $67, more money than most people saw in a year, and all of it somehow her responsibility now. "Miss Hartwell is 32 years of age," Henderson continued, reading from his notes like he was describing livestock. "She can read and write, has experience with domestic duties including cooking, cleaning, sewing, and gardening. She's also skilled in animal husbandry and basic veterinary care. Having assisted her father in his work, she's of sound health and moral character." He paused, cleared his throat, and added the words that made Clara want to disappear into the earth. "It should be noted that she has no children and is unlikely to bear any in the future." The murmur that ran through the crowd at this announcement was like the buzzing of angry wasps. Clara closed her eyes, wishing she could block out the sound of her most private shame being discussed like a defect in merchandise. "Bidding will start at $50, Henderson announced. "Do I hear 50? Silence stretched out like a held breath. Clara stood frozen on the crate, hands clasped so tightly in front of her that her fingernails cut into her palms. She could hear her heartbeat in her ears, could smell the scent of dust and manure and unwashed bodies. Someone coughed. A horse whinnied in the distance. $40? Henderson tried again, his voice carrying a note of concern. "She's a hard worker, folks, and those veterinary skills are valuable in cattle country." More silence. Clara felt sweat beading on her forehead despite the cold wind. In the crowd, she spotted Thomas standing with Margaret at his side, watching the proceedings with expressions that might have been satisfaction or might have been discomfort. Margaret's hand rested possessively on her slightly rounded belly, already carrying Thomas's child, the child Clara had never been able to give him. $35, called out a voice from the back of the crowd. Clara's head snapped up to see Jake Morrison, a widower in his 50s who ran a small farm outside town. She'd known him peripherally for years. He'd been kind to her after her father died, bringing her vegetables from his garden and asking after her health with genuine concern. $35 from Mr. Morrison, Henderson said with relief. "Do I hear 40? 40, came another voice. This time it was Bill Schneider, a man Clara knew by reputation as someone who went through hired help quickly and always seemed to have complaints about their laziness or incompetence. The thought of working for him made her stomach clench with anxiety. 45, Morrison countered immediately. 50, Schneider responded, his tone suggesting he was enjoying the competition. Clara felt like she was watching her life being decided by strangers bidding on her value like she was a piece of farm equipment. The numbers climbed slowly. 55, 60, 65. With each increase, Clara tried to read the faces of the two men, wondering which fate would be worse. Working for the kind but desperately lonely Morrison, who might expect more from their arrangement than she was prepared to give, or laboring for Schneider, whose hired hands never seemed to last more than a season. $70, Morrison said finally, his voice tight with the strain of spending money he probably couldn't afford. Schneider hesitated, considering. $70 was more than the debt required, more than most people in town earned in several months. He shook his head and stepped back, conceding defeat. $70 from Mr. Morrison, Henderson announced. Going once, going twice. $100. The voice came from the very back of the crowd, low and gravelly, but carrying clearly in the still air. Every head turned to see who had spoken. Clara strained to look over the crowd, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and terror. $100 was an enormous sum, enough to not only clear her debt, but leave money left over. But who would pay such an amount, and what would they expect in return? The crowd parted slowly, reluctantly, to reveal a man Clara had never seen before. He was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing the practical clothes of a working rancher, canvas pants, a cotton shirt rolled up to the elbows, and boots that had seen hard use. His hat shadowed most of his face, but she could see a strong jaw covered with several days' worth of dark stubble. He walked forward with the measured pace of a man comfortable in his own skin, seemingly unaware of or unconcerned by the stares following his progress. When he reached the front of the crowd, he pushed his hat back slightly, revealing eyes the color of storm clouds, and a face weathered by years of outdoor work. $100, he repeated, looking directly at Henderson rather than at Clara. His voice held no emotion, stating the amount like he was ordering supplies at the general store. Henderson blinked rapidly, clearly thrown off balance by this unexpected development. May I ask your name, sir? Jacob Wade, the man replied. I own the Circle W ranch about 20 miles north of here. A murmur ran through the crowd. The Circle W was known throughout the county, a successful cattle operation that had been struggling since the owner's wife died a few years back. Clara had heard talk about Jacob Wade in church circles, how he was trying to raise 3 children alone while keeping a ranch running. Mr. Wade, Henderson said carefully, that's a very generous offer, but I feel obligated to point out that Miss Hartwell's condition makes her unsuitable for certain types of domestic arrangements. Jacob Wade's eyes moved to Clara for the first time since he'd made his bid. She felt pinned under his gaze, like he was seeing straight through to her soul and taking inventory of what he found there. His expression revealed nothing of his thoughts. I have 3 children who need looking after, Wade said finally, his attention returning to Henderson. The youngest is only 6 years old. I need someone who can cook, clean, teach letters and numbers, and help with ranch work when necessary. Miss Hartwell's condition is irrelevant to those requirements. The way he said the word condition made it sound like he was discussing the weather rather than Clara's most profound personal failure. There was no pity in his voice, no judgment, just practical acknowledgement of facts that bore no particular importance to his situation. $100 is far more than necessary to settle the debt, Henderson pointed out. Wade shrugged. Maybe I don't like seeing people sold off like livestock to cover other folks' mistakes. The rebuke was quietly delivered, but unmistakable. Several people in the crowd shifted uncomfortably, and Clara saw Thomas flush red around the collar. Going once, Henderson said, looking around the crowd for other bidders. Morrison had already stepped back, clearly unable to compete with such a sum. Schneider was nowhere to be seen. Going twice. Clara held her breath, hardly daring to believe that this nightmare might be ending. Sold to Mr. Jacob Wade for $100. The sound of those words seemed to echo strangely in Clara's ears. Sold. She had been sold, like a horse or a cow or a piece of furniture. But somehow, when Jacob Wade stepped forward to count bills into Henderson's palm, the transaction felt different from what she'd expected. There was dignity in the way Wade conducted himself, a respect for the gravity of what was happening that the other bidders had lacked. When the money had changed hands and the necessary papers signed, Wade finally approached Clara directly. Up close, she could see that he was probably in his mid-30s, with lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent squinting into prairie sunlight. His hands, when he briefly touched his hat brim in greeting, were calloused from hard work, but clean and well kept. Ma'am, he said quietly, his voice pitched for her ears alone. I know this isn't what anyone dreams of when they're young, but I give you my word that you'll be treated with respect in my house, and you'll earn every penny of what I paid through honest work, nothing more. Clara nodded, not trusting her voice to remain steady. The kindness in his tone after the humiliation of the auction threatened to break down the careful control she'd maintained throughout the ordeal. I have a wagon over by the livery stable, Wade continued. If you're ready, we can get started toward home. It's a long ride, and I'd like to be back before the children start worrying. Clara gathered her few belongings, the single carpetbag that contained everything she now owned in the world, and followed Jacob Wade through the dispersing crowd. She could feel eyes on her back, could hear the whispered conversations already beginning about what had just transpired. By evening, the story would have spread to every household in Willow Creek, growing more scandalous with each telling. Wade's wagon was sturdy but well used, clearly built for utility rather than comfort. He helped her up onto the bench seat with a courtesy that spoke of good upbringing, then swung up beside her with the easy grace of someone who'd been climbing into wagons since childhood. As they drove through the main street of Willow Creek, Clara found herself taking what might be her last look at the place where she'd lived her entire life. There was the church where she'd been married with such hope 16 years ago. There was the general store where she'd shopped for household necessities, dreaming of the day she'd be buying children's clothes and school supplies. There was the cemetery where her father lay buried under a simple wooden cross she'd carved herself. All of it was behind her now, receding into memory as Jacob Wade's wagon carried her toward an uncertain future. They rode in silence for the first hour, the town giving way to rolling prairie dotted with cattle and the occasional farmhouse. The spring air was crisp but warming, carrying the scent of new grass and wildflowers. Under different circumstances, Clara might have enjoyed the ride, but the enormity of what had just happened to her life made it difficult to appreciate the beauty around her. Finally, Wade spoke. "I suppose you're wondering what you've gotten yourself into." Clara turned to look at him, studying his profile as he kept his eyes on the road ahead. The thought had occurred to me. Fair enough. Wade was quiet for a moment, seemingly choosing his words carefully. "My wife Emma died 3 years ago, giving birth to what would have been our 4th child. Lost them both. Since then, I've been trying to manage a ranch and raise 3 children on my own, and I'll be honest with you, I'm not doing a very good job of either." Clara felt a pang of sympathy. She knew what it was like to lose children, even ones who'd never drawn breath. "The children are good kids," Wade continued, "but they need more than I can give them. They need someone who can teach them properly, someone who can make our house feel like a home instead of just a place where we sleep and eat. They need—" He paused, seeming to struggle with the words. "They need a mother, even if she can't be their real mother." "And you think I can be that for them?" Clara asked quietly. Wade glanced at her then, his storm-gray eyes serious. "I think someone who's been hurt the way you have might understand how precious it is to be needed. And I think children who've lost their mother might be grateful for someone who chooses to love them, even if she didn't give birth to them." The simple wisdom of his words hit Clara harder than she'd expected. She'd spent so many years defining herself by what she couldn't do, couldn't give, couldn't be. The possibility of being valued for what she could offer was so foreign, it almost seemed dangerous to contemplate. "What exactly would you expect from me?" she asked, needing to understand the terms of their arrangement. "Honest work," Wade replied immediately. "Help with the children, keeping house, cooking meals. During busy seasons, I might need help with ranch work too. Extra hands are always useful during branding time or roundup. In return, you'll have room and board, a small wage when I can afford it, and—" He paused. "And you'll be treated as part of the family, not as hired help." Clara felt something loosen in her chest at his words. "And if it doesn't work out? If the children don't take to me, or if I can't manage what you need?" "Then we'll figure something else out," Wade said simply. "I'm not in the habit of throwing people away when they don't meet my expectations. Life's too hard out here for that kind of waste." They continued riding as the sun climbed higher in the sky, the landscape gradually changing from open prairie to rolling hills dotted with pine trees. Wade pointed out landmarks as they traveled, the creek where his cattle watered, the boundary markers of his property, the distant mountains that caught snow even in summer. "Tell me about your children," Clara said as they paused to rest the horses at a small stream. Wade's entire demeanor softened when he spoke about them. "Samuel's my oldest. He's 14 now, almost a man, but still trying to figure out what that means. He's been trying to take his mother's place in a lot of ways, looking after the younger ones, but it's too much responsibility for someone his age." He handed Clara a canteen of water, which she accepted gratefully. "Then there's Michael. He's 10, and he's—" Wade smiled slightly. "Well, he's 10, full of energy and questions and schemes that usually end with something broken or someone crying. Good heart, but he needs a firm hand sometimes." "And the youngest?" Wade's expression grew tender. "Rose. She's 6 now, but she was only 3 when Emma died. She barely remembers her mother, but she knows something's missing. She's been quiet since we lost Emma. Too quiet for a little girl." Clara felt her heart clench with sympathy for these children she hadn't yet met. "It must have been so hard for all of you." "It was," Wade acknowledged simply. "Still is, in some ways. But children are resilient. They adapt to what they have to adapt to. I just want to give them the chance to be children again, instead of little adults trying to hold everything together." As they resumed their journey, Clara found herself thinking about what lay ahead. She'd gone from wife to divorcee to purchased housekeeper all in the span of a week. It should have felt like the ultimate degradation, but somehow it didn't. There was something about Jacob Wade's quiet dignity, his obvious love for his children, and his straightforward approach to their arrangement that made her feel more hopeful than she had in years. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon when they finally crested a hill, and Wade pointed ahead to a collection of buildings nestled in a valley. "There it is," he said. "Home." The Circle W ranch spread out below them like a picture from a book. The main house was a substantial log structure with a wide front porch and stone chimney. Outbuildings included a large barn, several corrals, a chicken coop, and what appeared to be a bunkhouse for hired hands. Cattle dotted the surrounding pastures, and Clara could see horses grazing in a nearby meadow. It was beautiful in its practical simplicity, clearly the result of years of hard work and careful planning. But there were also signs of the struggles Wade had mentioned. A sagging fence line here, overgrown garden beds there, the kind of maintenance issues that accumulated when one person was trying to do the work of two. As their wagon approached the main house, Clara saw 3 figures emerge onto the front porch. Even from a distance, she could tell these were Wade's children, standing close together and watching the approaching wagon with curiosity and wariness. "Remember," Wade said quietly as they drew nearer, "they've been disappointed before. It might take some time for them to warm up to you." Clara nodded, smoothing her skirts and trying to prepare herself for this first crucial meeting. Everything would depend on these next few minutes. Whether she could connect with these grieving children, whether they could see past their natural suspicion to the care she was already feeling for them. Wade brought the wagon to a stop in front of the porch, and Clara got her first clear look at the children who might become her family. The oldest, Samuel, was clearly his father's son, tall for 14, with the same dark hair and serious gray eyes. He stood protectively in front of his younger siblings, his posture suggesting he was prepared to defend them if necessary. Michael, the 10-year-old, was fair-haired like his mother must have been, with a face full of freckles and bright, intelligent eyes that seemed to be taking in every detail of Clara's appearance. He bounced slightly on the balls of his feet, energy barely contained, and rose. Clara's breath caught when she saw the little girl. She was delicate and blonde, with huge blue eyes that seemed too solemn for someone so young. She pressed close to Samuel's side, one small hand clutching the fabric of his shirt. "Children," Wade said as he climbed down from the wagon and moved to help Clara. "This is Miss Clara. She's come to stay with us and help take care of things around the ranch." Clara stepped down from the wagon, very aware that 3 pairs of eyes were studying her every move. She smoothed her skirts and tried to smile warmly without appearing too eager. "Hello," she said simply, addressing all 3 but letting her gaze linger on Rose's solemn little face. "I'm very pleased to meet all of you." Samuel stepped forward, clearly taking his role as man of the house seriously despite his youth. "Ma'am," he said politely, touching his hat brim in a gesture that mimicked his father's manners. "Welcome to the Circle W." Michael was less formal. "Are you going to be our new ma?" he asked with the blunt curiosity of childhood. "Michael," Samuel hissed in embarrassment, but Clara held up a gentle hand. "That's a fair question," she said, looking directly at the boy. "I'm here to help your father and to take care of you, but I know you already had a mother who loved you very much. I'm not here to try to replace her." "Then what are you here for?" This came from Rose, her small voice barely above a whisper. Clara knelt down so she was at the little girl's eye level. "I'm here because everyone needs someone to take care of them, and sometimes families need a little extra help to work properly. Maybe I can help make sure you have good meals and clean clothes, and someone to read you stories at bedtime." Rose considered this gravely. "Do you know any good stories?" Clara smiled, feeling the first crack in the wall of reserve around her heart. "I know lots of stories. About brave princesses and talking animals and magical gardens where anything can grow if you tend it carefully enough." "I like stories," Rose admitted, taking a small step closer. Wade cleared his throat. "Let's get Miss Clara settled in the house, and then we can all get acquainted over supper. Samuel, can you help me get her things?" The inside of the house was clean but clearly showed the signs of 3 years without a woman's touch. The furniture was sturdy and well made, but there were no curtains at the windows, no flowers on the table, none of the small touches that made a house feel like a home. Clara's trained eye took in the details automatically. Floors that needed a good scrubbing, windows that hadn't been properly cleaned in months, corners where dust had accumulated. Wade led her up a narrow staircase to a small bedroom under the eaves. "This was Emma's sewing room," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "I thought you might be comfortable here." The room was simple but pleasant, with a single window that looked out over the ranch yard toward the mountains. A narrow bed, a washstand, and a small chest of drawers comprised the furniture. It was more space than Clara had had to herself since leaving Thomas's house. "It's perfect," she said honestly. "Thank you." Wade set her carpet bag on the bed and turned to face her. "Clara, Miss Clara, I want you to know that I meant what I said earlier. You'll be treated with respect in this house. The children might test you some. They've had their world turned upside down more than once. But they're good kids at heart." Clara nodded. "I understand. And Mr. Wade, thank you for what you did today, for bringing me here instead of letting me go to." She shuddered slightly, thinking of what her fate might have been with Bill Schneider, or even the well-meaning but lonely Jake Morrison. "Jacob," Wade corrected gently, "we're not formal people here, and you don't need to thank me. Something tells me this arrangement is going to benefit all of us." After he left her to settle in, Clara sat on the edge of the bed and looked around at what was to be her new home. Through the window she could hear the children's voices in the yard below, could see the vast expanse of ranch land stretching toward the distant mountains. It was beautiful and peaceful, and utterly foreign to everything she'd known in her previous life. But for the first time in months, she felt something that might have been hope stirring in her chest. The first few weeks at the Circle W passed in a blur of adjustment and discovery. Clara threw herself into the work of making the house a proper home, but she was careful to make changes gradually, not wanting to erase all traces of the children's mother or make them feel like their familiar world was being dismantled. She started with practical improvements, properly cleaning the windows to let in more light, scrubbing the floors until they gleamed, organizing the kitchen for maximum efficiency. She mended torn clothing and missing buttons, restored order to the chaos of the children's belongings, and established routines that brought structure to their days. The children's reactions to her presence varied widely. Samuel treated her with polite respect, but maintained a careful distance, clearly torn between appreciation for the improvements she was making and loyalty to his mother's memory. He was helpful when asked, but never volunteered assistance, and Clara sensed he was waiting for her to prove herself worthy of his trust. Michael was more openly welcoming, though his enthusiasm sometimes manifested in ways that tested Clara's patience. He showed her every corner of the ranch, introduced her to his favorite animals, and peppered her with endless questions about her previous life. But he also tracked mud through her clean kitchen, forgot to do his chores when something more interesting caught his attention, and had a talent for creating chaos wherever he went. Rose was the most challenging, and, paradoxically, the one Clara found herself most drawn to. The little girl was polite but distant, watching Clara with those two serious blue eyes as if trying to determine whether this new person in their lives could be trusted. She submitted to having her hair braided and her face washed, but she didn't chatter or laugh the way a 6-year-old should. It was Rose who finally gave Clara her first real test as a surrogate mother. 3 weeks after Clara's arrival, Rose developed a fever that spiked alarmingly during the night. Clara woke to the sound of the child crying and found her burning with heat, tossing restlessly in her small bed. "Jacob!" Clara called out, not caring about propriety in her fear for the child. Jacob appeared in the doorway within seconds, his hair tousled from sleep but his eyes immediately alert. "What is it?" "Rose is very sick," Clara said, gently placing a cool cloth on the little girl's forehead. "Her fever is dangerously high." Jacob knelt beside the bed, placing his large hand on his daughter's burning cheek. Rose whimpered and turned toward the coolness of his touch. "Should I ride for the doctor?" he asked. Clara was already moving, her mind cataloging everything she knew about treating fevers. "It would take hours to get him here, and we can't wait that long. I need willow bark tea, cool cloths, and a basin of lukewarm water. We have to bring her temperature down." For the next several hours, Clara worked tirelessly over Rose's small form. She bathed the child in tepid water to cool her skin, spooned willow bark tea between her cracked lips, drop by drop, and never left her side. Jacob hovered nearby, his face etched with the kind of terror only a parent can know. "She's not responding," he said hoarsely, as dawn light began filtering through the windows. "Maybe we should—" "Look," Clara whispered, pointing to Rose's face. The deathly flush was beginning to fade from the child's cheeks, and her breathing seemed less labored. By mid-morning, Rose's fever had broken completely. She opened her eyes and asked for water in a voice that was weak but rational. Clara nearly wept with relief. "You saved her," Jacob said quietly, watching Clara help Rose sit up to drink. Clara shook her head. "I just did what needed doing. Anyone would have—" "No," Jacob interrupted firmly. "Not anyone. You knew exactly what to do, and you didn't panic. You saved my daughter's life." Later, as Rose slept peacefully and the immediate crisis had passed, Jacob found Clara sitting on the front porch, exhaustion written in every line of her body. "Thank you," he said simply, settling into the chair beside her. Clara looked at him, seeing her own emotional exhaustion reflected in his weathered features. "She's a special little girl. I couldn't bear to lose her." "She's taken to you more than I expected," Jacob observed. "Even before she got sick, I could see her watching you, trying to figure out if it was safe to care about you. And what conclusion do you think she's reached?" Jacob smiled slightly. "Well, when she was delirious with fever last night, she kept calling for you. Not for Emma, not for me. You. I think that tells us everything we need to know about how she feels." Clara felt tears prick at her eyes. In nursing Rose through her illness, she had felt something awaken in her heart that she'd thought was dead forever. The fierce, protective love of a mother for her child. Not the desperate, grasping love she'd felt for the babies she'd lost, but something deeper and more generous. A love that asked nothing in return, except the chance to keep giving. Over the following weeks, the change in the family dynamic was unmistakable. Rose began following Clara around the house, helping with simple tasks and chattering about everything and nothing. Michael started bringing Clara interesting rocks and wildflowers, clearly competing for her attention and approval. Even Samuel began to soften, occasionally asking for her opinion on ranch matters or lingering in the kitchen while she cooked dinner. Clara found herself falling into the rhythm of ranch life more easily than she'd expected. She learned to read the weather and cloud formations the way Jacob did, to recognize the different calls cattle made when they were content versus distressed. She helped with the spring branding, proving herself capable of working alongside the hired hands without slowing them down. But it was the quiet moments that meant the most. Reading stories to Rose at bedtime, helping Michael with his arithmetic, discussing the finer points of animal husbandry with Samuel. These children, who had started as strangers connected to her only by an economic transaction, were becoming the family she'd never thought she'd have. The transformation wasn't just in Clara's relationship with the children. She began to notice changes in herself as well. The constant anxiety that had plagued her for years began to ease. She woke each morning with purpose, knowing that people depended on her not for what she could produce, but for what she could nurture and protect. Her hands, once idle and restless, now stayed busy from dawn to dusk with meaningful work. And then there was Jacob himself. Clara found herself watching him when she thought he wasn't looking, noting the way his shoulders relaxed when he came home to find dinner ready and the children clean and happy. She observed how gently he handled Rose when she woke from nightmares, how patiently he taught Samuel the intricacies of ranch management, how he managed to discipline Michael's exuberance without crushing his spirit. Jacob Wade was a good man, not perfect, but fundamentally decent in ways that had nothing to do with charm or appearance. He worked harder than any man should have to, never complained about his circumstances, and treated Clara with a respect she'd never experienced even in her marriage. It was during the summer of her first year at the Circle W that Clara first allowed herself to wonder if their arrangement might become something more than practical convenience. The realization came on a particularly hot July evening. Clara was sitting on the front porch shelling peas for dinner while Rose played with a rag doll at her feet. The heat had been oppressive all day, and even now, with the sun beginning its descent toward the horizon, the air shimmered with accumulated warmth. Jacob emerged from the barn where he'd been tending a sick calf, his shirt damp with sweat and his hair pushed back from his forehead. He looked tired, but satisfied. The calf was going to recover. "How's our patient?" Clara asked, setting aside her bowl of peas. "Ornery enough to complain about the medicine," Jacob replied with a slight smile. "I think he'll be fine." He settled into the chair beside hers with a weary sigh, stretching his long legs out in front of him. For a moment, they sat in comfortable silence, watching Rose arrange her doll's dress with careful precision. "She's gotten so much more talkative since you've been here," Jacob observed, nodding toward his daughter. Clara smiled, watching Rose's serious concentration. "She just needed to know it was safe to be a little girl again." "We all did, I think," Jacob said quietly. Something in his tone made Clara look at him more carefully. He was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite interpret, thoughtful and tender and perhaps a little uncertain. "Clara," he began, then stopped, seeming to wrestle with his words. "I need to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly." Clara's heart began to beat faster. "All right. Are you happy here?" "Really happy, not just making the best of a bad situation?" The question caught her off guard. She'd been so focused on proving herself useful, on earning her place in their lives, that she hadn't stopped to consider her own happiness. She began, then paused to think seriously about his question. "Yes," she said finally. "I am happy here. Happier than I've been in years, if I'm being honest." Jacob nodded slowly. "Good. That's good. Why do you ask?" He was quiet for a long moment, watching the sun sink lower toward the mountains. "Because I've been thinking about our arrangement, and I realize I might have done you a disservice." Clara's stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" "When I brought you here, I told you I needed someone to help with the children and the house. And you've done that beyond anything I could have hoped for. But somewhere along the way, this stopped feeling like an employment arrangement and started feeling like—" He paused, searching for the right words. "Like a real family." Clara's breath caught. "Jacob, the thing is," he continued, still not looking at her directly, "I don't want to keep you here under false pretenses. If you want to stay just as things are, as my housekeeper and the children's caretaker, that's fine. But if you might want something more, if you might want to really be part of this family—" He finally turned to meet her eyes. "I'd be honored to ask you to be my wife." Clara felt the world tilt around her. Marriage. The word brought back memories of disappointment and failure, of never being enough for Thomas no matter how hard she tried. "Jacob," she whispered, "I can't give you children." "We both know that. Why would you want to marry someone who can't—" "Stop," Jacob interrupted gently but firmly. "Just stop right there. You've given me 3 children who laugh again, who look forward to coming home from their chores, who sleep peacefully at night because they know someone who loves them is watching over them. You've given me a home instead of just a house. You've given me—" He paused, his voice growing rough with emotion. "You've given me back my family." Clara stared at him, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. "I'm not asking you to marry me because I need a housekeeper or because I think it's practical," Jacob continued. "I'm asking because somewhere in the past year I fell in love with you. Not with what you could do for me, but with who you are." Tears began to slip down Clara's cheeks. "You love me?" I love how patient you are with Rose's questions and Michael's energy. I love how you never make Samuel feel like he has to choose between being a child and being responsible. I love how you sing while you work, and how you never complain about anything, no matter how difficult. I love your strength and your gentleness, and the way you make everything better just by being there. He reached out and gently wiped a tear from her cheek with his thumb. But most of all, he said softly, I love that you chose to stay with us when you could have left. You could have gone anywhere, started over somewhere new where nobody knew your story. But you stayed, and you made us your family, not because you had to, but because you wanted to. Clara couldn't speak around the tightness in her throat. No one had ever spoken to her this way before, with such understanding of who she really was, such appreciation for the things she could give, rather than disappointment in what she couldn't. I don't need an answer right now, Jacob said, apparently taking her silence for uncertainty. I just wanted you to know how I feel, and that if you're interested in making this arrangement permanent and official, I'd be the happiest man in the territory. Clara found her voice at last. Yes, Jacob blinked. Yes, yes, I want to marry you. Yes, I want to be part of this family officially. Yes, I love you too, more than I ever thought it was possible to love someone. The smile that spread across Jacob's weathered features was like sunrise after a long, dark night. He reached for her hands, holding them gently in his calloused palms. Are you sure? Because once we do this, there's no going back. You'll be stuck with all of us permanently. Clara laughed, the sound bubbling up from someplace deep in her chest where joy had been stored away for so long she'd forgotten it existed. I can't think of anywhere I'd rather be stuck. They were married 3 weeks later in the small church in Willow Creek, with the children standing as witnesses and half the county in attendance. Clara wore a dress she'd made herself from fabric Jacob had driven 30 miles to buy, soft blue wool that brought out her eyes and made her feel beautiful for the first time in years. As they stood at the altar, Clara caught sight of Thomas in the back of the church. He looked older, more worn, and there was something in his expression that might have been regret. Margaret was notably absent, and Clara had heard whispers that their marriage was troubled, that the young wife's demands and complaints were wearing on Thomas's patience and finances. But Clara felt no satisfaction in his apparent unhappiness, only a distant sort of pity. She was too busy being grateful for the journey that had brought her to this moment, standing beside a man who loved her exactly as she was, surrounded by children who had chosen to call her mother, embarking on a future that held more promise than she'd ever dared to imagine. Do you, Clara Hartwell, take Jacob Wade to be your lawfully wedded husband? Reverend Matthews asked. I do, Clara replied, her voice clear and sure. When Jacob kissed her after they were pronounced husband and wife, she tasted possibility and hope, and the sweet promise of years to come. The first years of their marriage brought challenges that tested their commitment but ultimately strengthened their bond. A drought the summer after their wedding threatened to destroy the ranch's cattle, but Clara's careful management of their resources and her skill at finding water sources helped them weather the crisis better than many of their neighbors. Samuel grew into a young man of integrity and capability, eventually taking over much of the day-to-day ranch operations, so Jacob could focus on expanding their land holdings and improving their breeding stock. When he married a sweet girl from town at the age of 22, Clara felt all the pride and joy of a mother watching her son take his first steps toward independence. Michael channeled his boundless energy into becoming one of the finest horsemen in the territory, with a particular talent for breaking wild broncos that earned him respect from cowboys twice his age. His exuberant personality made him popular with everyone he met, but he never lost the fundamental kindness that had endeared him to Clara from the beginning. Rose bloomed under Clara's nurturing care, growing from a silent, wary child into a confident young woman with her own dreams and ambitions. She learned to read not just basic texts, but literature and poetry, developed a talent for music that filled their home with song, and eventually became a teacher in the local school, passing on the love of learning that Clara had instilled in her. But perhaps the greatest test of Clara and Jacob's marriage came 5 years after their wedding, when Clara discovered she was pregnant. The realization hit her like a physical blow. After years of accepting her inability to bear children, the possibility seemed too impossible to be real. But as weeks passed and the signs became unmistakable, Clara found herself caught between desperate hope and paralyzing fear. What if she lost this baby too? What if her body failed her again in front of the children who now looked to her as their mother? What if Jacob's love couldn't survive another disappointment? She managed to hide her condition for 2 months, but eventually Jacob noticed her morning sickness and the way she'd begun to avoid certain foods. "Clara," he said gently one evening after the children had gone to bed, "are you going to tell me what's been worrying you, or am I going to have to guess?" Clara looked up from her mending, seeing nothing but love and concern in his eyes. She set aside her work and took a shaky breath. "I'm pregnant." Jacob went very still. "Are you certain?" Clara nodded, watching his face carefully for any sign of disappointment or fear. Instead, she saw wonder spreading across his features like dawn breaking over the mountains. "Clara," he whispered, reaching for her hands. That's wonderful news." "Is it?" Clara asked, her voice small. "What if I lose this baby too? What if my body can't—" "Then we'll grieve together and move on," Jacob interrupted firmly. "But Clara, what if you don't lose this baby? What if everything goes perfectly and we get to hold our child in our arms?" Clara felt tears beginning to slip down her cheeks. "I'm so scared, Jacob. I want this so much, but I don't think I could survive losing another baby." Jacob pulled her into his arms, holding her against his chest while she wept out years of accumulated grief and fear. "You won't be going through this alone," he murmured into her hair. "Whatever happens, we'll face it together. And Clara, you're not the same woman you were in your first marriage. You're stronger now, healthier, happier. Your body knows how to nurture and protect. Look how you've cared for our children. Trust it to care for this baby too." The pregnancy progressed slowly, with Clara alternating between cautious joy and persistent anxiety. The children were thrilled by the news, especially Rose, who threw herself into preparing for the baby with all the enthusiasm of a 16-year-old who'd been wanting a sibling for years. Clara's body seemed to handle this pregnancy differently than her previous attempts. She felt stronger, more confident, more connected to the life growing within her. Jacob insisted she reduce her workload and hired additional help for the house, but Clara remained active and involved in ranch life. As her belly grew round and firm, Clara began to believe that maybe finally she would be able to carry a child to term. The baby kicked vigorously, responding to familiar voices and music. Clara found herself talking to her unborn child constantly, sharing stories about the ranch and the family that was waiting to welcome them. Labor began on a crisp October morning, nearly a year after Clara and Jacob's 6th wedding anniversary. Rose, now experienced in midwifery from helping other women in the community, attended Clara alongside the doctor Jacob had insisted on summoning from town. The labor was long and difficult, but Clara drew strength from Jacob's presence and the knowledge that she was surrounded by people who loved her. When their son finally entered the world with a lusty cry that could be heard throughout the house, Clara felt a completeness she'd never experienced before. "He's perfect," Jacob whispered, tears streaming down his cheeks as he held his son for the first time. "Clara, he's absolutely perfect." Clara reached up to touch the baby's tiny hand, marveling at the miracle of his existence. After so many years of believing herself barren, she had not only become mother to 3 wonderful children, but had given birth to one of her own. "What shall we call him?" Jacob asked. Clara looked around the room at the family that had gathered to welcome this new life. Samuel and his young wife, Michael grinning from ear to ear, Rose weeping happy tears as she held her new brother. "Hope," she said softly. "I want to call him Hope." "Hope Wade," Jacob repeated, testing the sound. "I like it. It suits him perfectly." Little Hope grew into a sturdy, cheerful child who brought even more joy to the already happy household. He had his father's gray eyes and his mother's gentle disposition, but there was something uniquely his own in the way he approached the world, with curiosity and confidence, and an absolute certainty that he was loved and valued. The older children doted on their baby brother, taking turns carrying him around the ranch and teaching him everything they knew about horses and cattle and the rhythms of ranch life. Hope's laughter became the soundtrack of their days, his milestones celebrated by the entire family as momentous occasions. But perhaps more important than Hope's birth was what it represented for Clara's sense of self. She had spent so many years defining herself by her failures, by what she couldn't do or couldn't be. The successful birth and raising of her son didn't erase those earlier losses, but it helped her understand that her worth as a woman and as a person had never been dependent on her ability to bear children. She had been valuable all along for her kindness, her intelligence, her capacity to love and nurture. The children she'd raised, both biological and chosen, were testament to that worth. The home she'd created, the lives she'd touched, the love she'd given and received, all of it had meaning that went far beyond the simple fact of reproduction. Years passed in the peaceful rhythm of ranch life. Samuel took over more and more of the ranch operations, eventually inheriting the Circle W when Jacob decided to step back from the day-to-day running of the business. Michael established his own horse breeding operation on land adjacent to the family ranch, specializing in the sturdy, intelligent horses that were in high demand throughout the territory. Rose married a young lawyer from the county seat, a man who appreciated her intelligence and education and supported her continued involvement in teaching and community work. She and her husband built a house in town but visited the ranch regularly, bringing their own children to spend summers running wild with their cousin Hope. Hope grew into a young man who combined the best qualities of both his parents, Jacob's strength and integrity, Clara's compassion and wisdom. He showed little interest in leaving the ranch for city life, instead throwing himself into learning every aspect of the operation and developing innovative approaches to cattle breeding and land management. As Clara and Jacob aged, they found themselves surrounded by the fruits of their life together: children and grandchildren, a successful ranch, a community that respected and valued their contributions. Clara had become known throughout the county as someone to call upon in times of crisis, whether medical emergencies, family disputes, or natural disasters. Her reputation for quiet competence and unwavering compassion made her a trusted figure in the lives of countless people. But it was in the quiet moments, sitting on their front porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, that Clara felt most grateful for the journey that had brought her to this place. "Do you ever think about how different things might have been?" Jacob asked one evening as they watched Hope and his young family playing in the yard below. Clara considered the question seriously. "Sometimes, but not with regret, if that's what you're asking. Everything that happened, the pain, the disappointment, even being sold at that auction, all of it led me here. Led me to you and the children and this life we've built together." Jacob reached over and took her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers in a gesture that had become as natural as breathing over their many years together. "I used to think Emma's death was the worst thing that could happen to us," he said quietly, "and it was terrible, losing her and the baby. But if she hadn't died, I would never have gone to that auction. I would never have found you." Clara squeezed his hand gently. "I don't think we're meant to understand why some things happen the way they do, but I do think we're meant to make the most of whatever circumstances we find ourselves in." As if summoned by their conversation, Rose appeared on the porch, carrying a tray of coffee and the ginger cookies that had become her specialty. "You two look awfully serious," she said, settling into a chair beside them. "Are you solving all the world's problems?" Clara smiled at the daughter of her heart, this vibrant woman who had grown from a silent, frightened child into someone who brought light wherever she went. "Just counting our blessings," Clara replied. Rose looked out over the ranch yard, where multiple generations of their family were gathered for their weekly Sunday dinner. Samuel was teaching his youngest son to rope fence posts. Michael was showing off his latest horse to an appreciative audience. Hope and his wife were planning additions to their own house, dreaming of the children they hoped to have. "We've been blessed indeed," Rose agreed softly. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Clara reflected on the long journey that had brought her to this moment. She had been sold at auction like a piece of property, valued at less than the price of a good horse. But that humiliation had led her to a life richer and more fulfilling than anything she could have imagined. She had learned that love came in many forms: the fierce protective love of a mother for her children, the steady companionate love of a marriage built on mutual respect and shared values, the generous love of a community that valued contribution over status. She had learned that worth wasn't measured in what you could produce, but in what you could nurture, protect, and inspire. Most importantly, she had learned that it was never too late to begin again, never too late to find family, never too late to discover that you were valued and loved exactly as you were. The night air was growing cool, and one by one the family members began to drift toward their own homes or guest rooms in the main house. Eventually, only Clara and Jacob remained on the porch, sitting in the comfortable silence of a couple who had shared decades of joys and sorrows. "Ready to go inside?" Jacob asked as the grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 10. Clara took one last look around at the ranch that had become her world, the house where she had learned to be a mother, the land where she had found her purpose, the place where she had discovered that being thrown away by one person could lead to being treasured by many others. "Yes," she said, rising from her chair and taking Jacob's offered arm. "I'm ready." As they walked into the house together, Clara felt the deep satisfaction of a life well lived. She had been broken and discarded, sold and forgotten. But she had also been redeemed and cherished, had found family where she least expected it, had built love from the ashes of disappointment. The woman who had once stood trembling on an auction block, measuring her worth in terms of her failures, had become someone whose value was measured in the lives she had touched, the love she had given, the family she had created through choice rather than chance. And in the end, that was worth far more than any price that could be paid at market. If this story of redemption, resilience, and the many faces of love touched something deep in your heart, you found your home. At Prairie Heart Stories, we believe that life's greatest defeats often lead to its most precious victories, that families are built by love rather than blood, and that it's never too late to discover your true worth. Stories like Clara and Jacob's remind us that sometimes we have to lose everything we thought we wanted to find, everything we actually needed. Sometimes our most painful moments lead us directly to our greatest joys. Subscribe and ring that bell to join our community of souls who understand that love is rarely easy, but always worth the fight. Because out here on the frontier of the heart, the most beautiful flowers grow in the hardest ground, and the strongest families are forged by choice, not chance. Welcome home, dear friends.